you need the same things as somebody else. And we said most of you have competed at something in your lives. It tends to be between closely related species, and I want to go back and look at the idea of species relationships. And we sort of started to talk about this in the context of like wolves and coyotes who compete, but then who also, we said, could sometimes interbreed. And thinking about those Galapagos finches, where the biologist was saying, yeah, you don't breed outside your species, even if it's physically possible. That's sort of the definition of species. So finch is a bigger term than you might think. It's a broader term. So like we could say wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs are all dogs. And that's true in that they are all canids. They're all in the same family. That was the term you used. You said, well, do they have to be in the same family? Right. So, you guys have probably not had, I actually want you to add this to your notes and whatever you're drawing these in. It's a concept that we'll come back to later, but it's a good thing to discuss repeatedly. The concept of biological classification. So, the way that I was always taught to remember it was King Philip came over for great spaghetti. King Philip came over for great spaghetti. If you're doing plants, it's usually King David, because instead of phylums, you have divisions. So, and this has even changed a little bit. Now we have this idea of domains of life. And those have maybe to some degree replaced kingdoms. That's not the important part. You have phylums of things that are related. And so like we're in the phylum Verbrata. So let's actually we'll do a couple examples. So you have phylum, you have class, you have order, family, genus, and species. So obviously two things that are the same species are very closely related. They share a lot of DNA. The amount of DNA that makes you and me, that makes, remember we said a 6'2" Danish supermodel and a 4'8" Central African pygmy look as different as they do is, like less than 0.0%, 0.01% or something? I mean, it's tiny. Humans share most of their DNA. So two things that are in the same species might be like two coyotes. And coyotes, who are my coyotes in here? Noah's a coyote, Brianna's a coyote. Do you remember their species? No, Canis latrans. So the genus, here, let's back that up a second. So for the coyote, it's we actually use two names to describe them. We use two names to describe all biological things, and that's their genus name and their species name. You can kind of think of this like your first name and last name, except in biology they're reversed. So if you have siblings who share your last name, and I'll pick on you because I had your brother, so I know that you guys have the same last name, and lots of siblings don't. That's a whole different matter. I look at a list and I say, oh, McNichol, Logan. Oh, McNichol, Justin. I wonder if they're related. So with Canis latrans, I can look at that, and I can also say, oh, Canis latrans. I wonder if they're related to Canis lupus. So also in the genus Canis, we have Canis lupus. This is the coyote. This, you know what Canis lupus might be? Wolf. Yeah, this is the wolf. Same genus, different species. Do not typically interbreed. Very often, not always, but often things that are in the same genus are physically capable of breeding. Like I said, not always. But as the biologist was saying, typically the definition of species is they don't, even if they physically can, for whatever reason. So they're really closely related. And let's see. I'm trying to think. I think mammal is the order, Mammalia. I'd have to look it up, honestly. Hold on, let's look it up. So the genus is Canis, and it's all things that are probably capable of interbreeding. The three that we think of right off the top are coyotes, wolves, domestic dogs. Jake, head up. The family is, and this is going to look really similar, Canidae. Okay, so the family is Canidae, which seems real similar, but this also includes things like foxes, which are not in the genus Canis. A fox and a coyote could not interbreed if they tried. If you left them in a room alone for a year with romantic music playing, they couldn't do it. Their chromosomes don't match. I mean, it wouldn't work. Where a coyote and a wolf can produce offspring, they typically don't. So these guys, coyote and wolf, share a family, share a genus, share a species. Well, if you share those things, you also share an order, and the order here is Carnivora. What does that sound like to you? Carnivorous, yeah. And so Carnivora includes also cats. It includes, I think, probably like the weasel and the badger and things like that. Carnivora probably also includes bears. Okay, the class is Mammalia. What is that? Mammals. This includes you. That's where you share a level of biological classification with coyotes and wolves. You're all mammals. The phylum is hard to read. Verbrata. What does that sound like? Vertebrates. Take your hand, put it on the back of your neck. You have a backbone. If you don't, we'll get you medical attention. You have a backbone. You're a vertebrate. So are coyotes. So are wolves. And under the old system, the kingdom was Animalia. Just animals. The domain would be eukaryotes, which we'll talk about later. So the more levels of classification two things share, the more closely related they are. Typically, and this was the long-winded answer to your nice short question, things that are in the same genus, that's about as far back as you can go and have two things that aren't the same species that then interbreed. So foxes, and my fox researcher is not here today, but shift that so it's even. So Canidae covers all those guys, but the red fox is Vulpes vulpes. Not in the same genus. No chance of interbreeding ever happening. Does that make sense? So typically you're going to see the closest competition between things that are most closely related, like coyotes and wolves, which out west compete pretty hard, actually. Red foxes are occupying a little bit different niche, though there is competition certainly between red foxes and coyotes. They compete with one another, but they're never going to interbreed. Okay, let's go back to competition. No, the coyote and the wolf are more closely related. They can interbreed. And that's where the eastern coyote comes from. If we had time to watch nothing but movies all year, there's a fantastic Nova called The Birth of the Eastern Coyote. And it's all about... So I'll give you the 5-minute synopsis. You had, in the East, no coyotes when the first European settlers arrived in the Ohio Territory. there were no coyotes here. This was dense, dark forest. We talked about that. And coyotes are not typically the western coyote was very much not a forest creature. It was a creature of deserts and scrublands and plains and prairies. When the first settlers started to move west and they started to encounter coyotes, they called them desert wolves, but they weren't. They were clearly really small. They're like a 30-pound creature, where a wolf could be a 75 or 80-pound creature. I mean, you think about the difference between, you've all been next to dogs. You know, a dog that comes up to nearly your hip versus a dog that comes up to your knee. That's a pretty substantial difference. So once we wiped out every single wolf in the eastern U.S., in the lower portion of the eastern U.S., there were a few pockets of wolves remaining, and those... So basically you had wolves here, coyotes pretty much here. You know, that was coyote territory at one time. And this is not, drawn with any great precision, but the Southwest, the West in general, probably, yeah, certainly I'm sure up into, Montana and maybe the Dakotas, but certainly not in the East. Well, we killed all the wolves. There were a few pockets of wolves that did not get killed off, and so up here in like the UP of Michigan and northern Minnesota, you had pockets of wolves that survived. Well, once there were no more wolves here, it's like a big job opening sign. Plus, we had changed the habitat significantly. No longer was this all dense forest. We had cut it down and made farm fields of it. And those cornfields and pastures look an awful lot like the grasslands of the western U.S., where the coyote was at home. So coyotes started to expand their range. Let me do this. So we'll say, if this is the original range of the coyote, they start to expand that range and expand that range, and for whatever reason, a lot of them end up in, not a lot, but enough, end up in areas where there are still a very few wolves left. Now, the wolves there have been threatened by a tremendous ecological pressure from what? Was it a parasite that crawled up their noses and ate their brains? What was it? Us! Kill them all! Kill them all! Right. That's kind of hard on a species. So you have little remnant wolf populations. Well, just like with those small and medium finches, where, they normally would not breed, but when there's almost nobody left, this is kind of like the scenario of, if you were the last man on earth, if you were the last woman on earth, well, yeah, I guess I would, because they're down to these very small numbers. And so it's in Algonquin National Park, actually, they've pinpointed it, that wolves and coyotes started to interbreed and raise young. And there were, basically you have wolf genes that coyotes end up sort of absorbing, and a new species emerges out of that. You have an episode of speciation. And the species that we get out of that is the, guess what? Eastern coyote. So the eastern coyote is really definitively a different species than the western coyote. We didn't really understand this until the last 10 or 15 years, because we didn't have the technology to sequence their DNA. But now we can look at their DNA and go, you got an awful lot of wolf genes in there. And so the eastern coyote then, let's see, we'll take coyotes plus wolves, and what we get is the eastern coyote. And the eastern coyote is a hybrid species, just like those, small/medium finches they were talking about in the Galapagos. The eastern coyote is better fit for the eastern U.S., for the environment we have here, where we have a combination of scrub, cropland, farms, forests, urban areas. The eastern coyote is tremendously adaptable. If there's anything that I want those of you who are studying the eastern coyote to get from the whole thing, is how insanely adaptable they are. I mean, like, they could be humans. They're that adaptable. There are eastern coyotes living in downtown Cleveland. Happily. They're fine with it. They are just that generalist. They're awesome. Okay, so let's go back to competition. Let me ask you this question. Do you remember what competitive exclusion was? So we have species competing. They need the same things. What happens if we say, oh, competitive exclusion occurred? What does that mean? Yeah, in essence, one species died out in that ecosystem. Somebody just could not compete, wasn't fast enough, strong enough, clever enough, well enough camouflaged, whatever, and they end up out of the ecosystem. So that's competitive exclusion. But what's the goal of all living things? Goal of biology is sex and not dying. Really, more specifically, making babies and not dying. Or maybe we should say not dying and making babies, because you have to not die in order to make babies. So you not die, you make babies, and you try to make sure your babies don't die. That's really it. So, in a desperate bid to not get competitively excluded, sometimes a species will evolve to reduce their risk of competitive exclusion. So species may change over time to use different resources that are available so that there is less competition pressure on them. Okay, and this is where we get to the idea of resource partitioning. If you partition something, you divvy it up. So you probably regularly partition food with your siblings or your friends. You share, and each of you gets part so that nobody stabs anybody else with a fork. I don't know how competitive your siblings are. But this has been observed in nature. So, and I was not aware of how recent an idea this was. In the 50s, they said, I think the guy from Crash Course said, and I don't remember the biologist's name now either, but looked at these little warblers and realized that they were actually dividing up the resource, because everybody looked at these. So this is kind of like your question about the finches. Well, they're all finches, right? These are 5 different species of warblers. What do you notice that's similar about them?
All very small birds.
Okay, they're all very small birds. They actually, can we expand this? If you look at their beaks are pretty similar. These are little bug-eating birds.
They almost have the same body type, just different.
Yeah, they really have very similar body shapes. Their tail shapes are similar. That's one big thing we use in classifying birds is tail shape. Yeah, I mean, these guys are, it's almost like the same bird wearing different feathers again and again and again. But what was known prior to this idea of resource partitioning is that they were different species. They have very different markings. They mate at different times, slightly, like by a week or so off. They're not interbreeding. They probably could. But what was always thought was, oh, well, all 5 of these species live in the pine forests of, I don't know if this is like New Jersey pine forests or what, but they all live in the same area. They all live in the same kinds of trees. They all eat the same kinds of things. They must just be an exception to competition. And what was discovered when you looked really closely, when you really very carefully analyzed, was no, actually, and this is the Cape May warbler, fed only in the tops, only on the outside edges. This is the yellow-rumped warbler. It fed on the whole bottom and 2 little tiny areas in near the trunk. And this is the Blackburnian, which fed only in the middle, only on the outsides, not along the trunk. And then that was the black-throated green. So this is the Blackburnian, which fed only on the outsides. And this is the bay-breasted, which fed only on the center by the trunk in the middle of the tree. So even in one tree, they were dividing up the resource so they didn't compete. They've kind of established all their own territories. They've put that masking tape line down the middle of the bedroom. And no, this side is mine, that side is yours. So they probably didn't all start out this way. But these species changed their habits to avoid getting excluded from the ecosystem. Okay, this point, what I'm going to do is cut you loose to start researching. You've got your template. You should now be researching predation, good Lord, predation, predators, prey, parasites, and competitive relationships. And I'm going to be grading these tomorrow. Actually, let's see. Start looking for mutualistic relationships also. You're probably, this is a personal challenge. I doubt any of you are going to find an honest-to-goodness commensal relationship. I'll tell you what. I'll give you 1 bonus point on this. So you can score like a 16 out of 15 if you find a well-supported, well-documented commensal relationship with your species and something else. Okay? So, go. You got 25 minutes. I'll give you some time tomorrow, too.